Mullen. The courses are ie411 and ie561, and this is lecture number 2. How about that? The first typo of the evening. That should be lecture 2, not lecture 3. What can I say? Okay, let's, yeah, and it's still get it up here. Yeah, this is lecture 2, so don't reset your watches. Much of what we know about safety is derived from studying accidents. And this lecture will introduce terminology and some theories that are useful to examine and prevent accidents. And you can read about this in Chapter 3. That's right, it is Chapter 3. But this is Lecture 2. Okay. We're going to talk about what are accidents, which seems kind of obvious. What are their costs? Why do they occur? How can we prevent them? And we're going to show some examples involving the automobile and the sinking of the Sultana. How many people have heard of the Sultana? Okay, none. No response. All right. Well, you'll know about it by the end of this lecture. Okay, accidents are one or more of unexpected, unforeseen, or unintended. People, if you cause it, it's not an accident. Okay, you don't want it to happen. Main consequences are injury, loss, damage. Damage, I mean to equipment, not people. That we usually call injuries. Also, they're usually disruptive. Anyone here ever been in an accident? Yeah. What happened to the rest of the day's plans? Gone, right? Okay. It may involve more than one event. Almost always are rare random events. We would hope so, anyways. And different people may define them differently. So if you're reading a paper on accidents, you got to figure out what they're talking about, because different people say different things are accidents. Okay, so here's an example, an auto collision. This guy's making a left turn and this guy runs into him. Okay. Whoops. Too quick. Okay. So the blue car was trying to make a left turn. It was hit by the red car, which was going straight. We have an interaction here between the situation, or among the situation, and the two drivers. This might have been changed if there was like four-way stop signs or a traffic light. Maybe this happened at night and it wasn't lit. Maybe this guy's headlights weren't working. All kinds of Mabels could have gone into this accident. Okay, the consequences, of course, would be injury to both cars, damage to both cars, and injury possibly to inhabitants of both cars. From the speed that guy came in, I'd say it'd be a pretty bad accident. Now here's another one. We have a roadway here, and then we have a narrow bridge, and the idea is the bridge is actually not as wide as the roadway. Anyone ever see a bridge like that? A narrow bridge? Yeah, you know what it's like. So this guy's tooling down the road and runs right into it. He was texting on his cell phone or something, wasn't paying attention, made the unreasonable assumption that the road would continue to be the same width all the way down, and this happened. So here we have an accident that involves a situation and an individual misreading the situation. This could have been alleviated, let's say, by having nice reflective barriers on the end, or maybe having crumpled zone barriers here, or maybe simply having a wider bridge. There's lots of things that could have gone on, and that's another kind of accident. Any questions at this point? Now, in this course, we're going to refer to an accident as something in which there is an injury or damage, and something that happened that's out of the ordinary but doesn't result in injury or damage, we're going to call an incident. Some people also call them accidents, okay? So that's one of the differences we want to be sure of. Okay, here's the Sultana, which nobody has heard about yet. It's 260 feet long, and the rated capacity was 376 passengers and crew. This event occurred in April 1865, which I think was before your time. It was the end of the Civil War. Lincoln had recently been assassinated, so the whole country was in a turmoil. And you had thousands of Union prisoners of war that had been held in prison camps in the South that wanted to get home. Okay? That was the situation. Now, there were 4 boilers on the Sultana, one of which was damaged. There was going on the Mississippi. The current was very strong because the snows had started melting. The ship was slightly overloaded, 2,600 passengers instead of 376. Just a trifle. We would say that maybe greed played a role here. The ship's captain was paid $5 for every man that he transported north. In today's economy, that would be about $70. In return, he would pay $1.15 back to the quartermaster to not notice how full the ship was getting, because the quartermaster had rules that he was supposed to follow on loading the ships. But he had a problem in that he had all these guys here, and he wanted to get them out because it was a problem housing and feeding all of them. So he got $1.15 kickback, which would be about $16. Now, it doesn't sound like too much, but altogether it added up to $9,240 for the captain, about $130,000. Not a lot of money, but enough to tempt people. And William Hatch, who was the quartermaster, he got $2,760, which would be about $38,000 in today's change. So most people feel this was the primary reason this happened. Here's an actual photograph of the Sultana. They had cameras in those days. Okay. It was rather new. And you can see here now how overloaded the ship was. And notice these pieces here and here and here. These were timbers that were put in place in order to prevent the promenade deck here from sagging under the weight of all the people standing on it. Remember, this was supposed to have no more than 460 people on it. Okay, and it had what, 2,600? So that's an actual photograph before the accident, of course. Here's the route it was going to take. Now, I've highlighted the Mississippi in red here, but if you look at it, I don't know how clear it comes out on the copy. It's kind of faint. Probably should have used a lighter highlighting. But you can see that the river twists and turns and zigs and zags and everything. So this is not the kind of thing where you can just go straight up the river. This traveling up the river involved a lot of going back and forth and back and forth. Okay, they were at Vicksburg, and they headed up, they made it to Memphis, and it was about, well, let's see, April 24th, 1865, 2,600 on board, headed north. Memphis, on the 26th, 2 days later, they loaded coal, and then on the 27th at 2 a.m., 10 miles north of Memphis, the accident occurred. Boiler explodes. And that led to a whole world of hurt, as they say. The immediate accident, at 2 a.m., the first boiler explodes. Shortly after, 2 more boilers explode. The ship was damaged and on fire. This was heard and seen 10 miles away in Memphis. This was at night now. The USS Grosbeck was in the area, and it departed to help. Other steamers in the area converged on the spot. By 9 a.m., the Sultana sinks. Now, we didn't have cell phones in those days, so we don't have any photographs of the ship actually burning. This was one artist's rendition. It was in one of the newspapers, I believe. And you can see the ship here, flames all over the place, and look at all the people in the water. Now, this water is very close to freezing, and it's at night. So if you don't get people out pretty quickly, they're not going to make it. Here's another artist's rendition. And as terrible as this thing is, it doesn't really show what really happened. And that is, oops. The boilers were in the center, and when they blew, they damaged the structure of the ship. So the ship kind of looked like this after the explosion. And in the center there was the fire. And what happened was the angle was steep enough that people were thrown directly into the fire. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't make it off the ship. It was really a nasty event. Okay, so what happened here? Many of the passengers were wounded or ill, so they really couldn't go running around. The water was cold and the current was swift. The Bostonia was in the vicinity, rescued 200 people. Officially, at least 1,550 died. They're not quite sure how many were actually on the ship. 200 of the survivors died later of complications, burns, infection, and that kind of thing. Now, as a comparison, how many people have heard of the Titanic? Everyone's heard of the Titanic. 1,500 people died on the Titanic. Okay? The Sultana was the worst maritime disaster for the U.S. The greatest loss of life in a single incident. And nobody heard of it. Well, what can I say? Here's a comparison. There's the Titanic. To the same scale, there is the Sultana. You could easily put the Sultana on the Titanic. Okay. And yet, you've got 1,500 fatalities here, and it makes the news. Eventually, 1,770 fatalities here, and nobody's heard of it. What can I say? There is a footnote on the Sultana, and that is a favorite nephew of Mark Twain died on that ship. And it said that his death eventually led to Tom Sawyer, the literary work. Not what I would call the greatest trade-off, though. Okay, so that's the Sultana, which you now know about. In the aftermath, there were 3 separate investigations. A lot of people died. And remember, these were returning war veterans. No blame was eventually assigned. The causes, the water level in the boiler was low, which led to a high pressure. But to put things in perspective, 600,000 people died in the Civil War. A couple of thousand more soldiers just didn't get that much press. Lots of people were dying in those days. This also had been 11 days after Lincoln was assassinated, so it's just a lot of newspapers didn't print much about it because they figured people had heard enough about this kind of stuff. In 1866, the Hartford Hartford Insurance Company started insuring steam boilers that met certain requirements, and because of that, most of the boilers in use at the time were replaced because they were found to be unsafe and unrepairable. Any questions or comments? Okay. This is what yes?
Is that still the worst maritime? Yes, maritime.
Well, I can't think of any. What have we had recently that had over 1,000 casualties involving a U.S. ship? Okay. I believe it still is, and I hope it remains the worst. We don't need anything that big anymore. We had that cruise ship that crashed that we talked about last time, but luckily that sank in shallow water. That might have been that bad. The water's cold there at this time of the year, but it didn't happen that way, and we're lucky in that respect. But it's not a U.S. ship anyway, so it wouldn't count in this particular set of records. But as far as I know, that's it. Okay, any other questions, comments? All right. This is what I mean about learning from our past events. even though nobody was found to be at fault, there still was a lot of concern about why this happened. But first, let's look at some terms here. Safety, that's kind of something everybody knows. Well, here we refer to it as an acceptable risk of harm. We can never be completely safe. A hazard is a potential for harm. It would be an unsafe physical condition, unsafe activities or hazards. The risk involves the likely loss, the chance of a loss, and the magnitude of that loss. So to illustrate, both of these guys face exactly the same hazard, and that is falling off what they're standing on and getting hurt. But this guy has a higher risk, because if he falls, the consequences will be more severe. Same hazard, different risk. Okay? And we'll get more on that later. A fellow by the name of Starr looked at lots and lots and lots of things that people do and came to the conclusion that this function here, which is approximately b cubed, which is the ratio of the risk, the probability of something bad happening involving how long you're exposed at doing that, is fairly consistent. Involuntary refers to the kinds of things the general public faces. Okay, for example, electrical outlets. Voluntary refers to things that people do that they don't have to do. For example, jumping out of perfectly good working airplanes. And we see the ratio here, this is logarithmic, it's roughly 1,000 to 1. People are willing to accept about 1,000 times as much risk in an area they have some expertise or a special interest in than in general. And as you see, this is the average benefit in dollars. This is rather old, so we'd probably have to update it. But anyways, we see as it becomes more valuable, people are willing to accept more risk. Well, that makes sense. But we see that there is a general trend, and we generally try to use this kind of thing to decide if things are safe enough. If we're in this area, then it's safe enough for the general public. If we're in this area, it's safe enough for volunteers. As we mentioned before, engineers are involved. We can have a design flaw, but also things that we do can impact other aspects of the safety balance. And let me just use an example here. Here's an automobile. How many people know what an automobile is? Hey, well, okay. How many people have an automobile? How many people drove one today? Still quite a few. Okay, so this is something we're familiar with. Obviously, we can have a design flaw, and we could have parts that fail. Maybe the windows are too small for us to see when backing up. That seems to be a trend nowadays. The rear windows are getting smaller and smaller. So now they sell you those little cameras to go in back because you can't see looking out the window. Those kinds of things. Even if you've got the best design, though, if it's not made right, it's going to be a bad thing. So you could have things that are not tightened sufficiently. We could have leaks. We could have things that are weaker than they're supposed to be. Cars are fairly well regulated, though, and this kind of stuff tends to get caught, although we have had recalls. Operator error, well, obviously there's not a lot of control on the operator of an automobile. There are safety programs, but not everybody goes into them. One common problem we have is people tailgating. And engineers have tried to deal with this by coming up with the brakes that work better. And that kind of pushes things back for a while. But then what we found out is people just start following closer. So there's a trade-off in here that we still don't understand very well. Adverse environment, ice, rain, fog, snow. The biggest thing usually on this is tires, although some cars now have active control systems and independent traction to kind of deal with it. You can have poor maintenance. Okay, how many people have their oil changed every 3,000 miles? Well, their car's oil. About a third of the class, maybe a half. Okay, that's a problem. Belts, you don't want them breaking when you're in the middle of the desert, you know, that kind of thing. You can always have a malfunction, no matter how good you make things. So we're going to talk about dual brakes to try to deal with that. Of course, there is collision. We're going to talk about the safety cage later also. And there's the matter of safety belts and their ease of use, and I'm going to talk about that later too. So we'll talk about a few things in detail. Here's dual braking. Prior to 1967, you would have one cylinder in here in the master cylinder, and there would be one hydraulic circuit. And the trouble would be is if you got a hole anywhere in these pipes, the hydraulic fluid would leak out and you'd have no brakes. Then Bendix developed the dual master cylinder, which has two cylinders, and the dual braking system. And the idea here is that this rear wheel and both front wheels are on this cylinder, and this rear wheel and the two front wheels are on this cylinder, and there's a valve here. And if you happen to get a hole in one of these systems and everything leak out, then the valve will isolate that part, which means the other master cylinder then provides braking pressure to both front wheels and the rear wheel, one rear wheel, and this gives us a stability problem, but still gives us about 60% to 80% of the braking we would have instead of 0%. And this has been mandatory in U.S. cars since 1967. So chances are, unless you have an antique car, you have a dual braking system in them. Okay? So the idea here is the problem we'd have is these lines would rust and they would get a leak, and then people would lose their brakes, and then you'd have a crash. So this reduced considerably the number of crashes people get, together with maintenance to check for holes in the pipes and things like that. Okay, that's dual braking. Any question on that? No, okay. Now, we talked about competing costs. Remember that the dollars that we need to spend in order to make things safer, definite and visible. The dollars that we realize from spending that are less definite and less visible. So let's look at the boilers. Boilers is a classic example of this trade-off. The material the boiler is made of, if you want to make it safer, you make it thicker. On the other hand, if you want to make things cheaper, you make it thinner. And this really pays off if you're in a vehicle like a locomotive or a ship, because less material means you have less weight to cart around as you're moving around, and your vehicle becomes more efficient. With low pressure, the system is safer, but with high pressure, it runs more efficiently. So people like, the operators like high pressure because they get more, well, I wouldn't want to say bang for the buck, but let's say things work out. Relief valve. You have one on the system, that's safer. But you know you can save money by not putting one on. And prior to 1865, oh, that's an accessory. You don't have to get it. The operator, to be safer, have someone like an engineer, I mean a real engineer. Cheapers to put some in there is semi-skilled, had some training, maybe 15 minutes worth. Maintenance, preventive maintenance, check things over, make sure everything is fine, look for any weakness in the system. But it's cheaper just to do breakdown maintenance, keep things running until something breaks, and then fix it. Okay? And then a barrier. A barrier, what we mean here is a structure around the boiler designed so that if the boiler explodes, pieces of the boiler don't go flying around and hitting people. A containment system. A nice thick one would be safer, but it's expensive, and if you're moving, it has extra weight, so the cheaper alternative is just not to have any. Now, the thing about the boiler, which makes it so interesting, is we see that virtually everything that makes it safer makes it more expensive. And virtually everything that makes it cheaper, in the definite sense, makes it less safe. But in the long run, the safety makes it less expensive. The trouble is those costs in the future are indefinite and uncertain. So here's a little history. In 1769, we had the first practical steam engine. In 1833, President Jackson asked for regulation in his State of the Union address. He did this because of the death of Senator Josiah Johnson. He had died in a boiler explosion, and he had known the senator fairly closely. And he says, we really need to go do something about this. It wasn't until 1938 that Congress got around to passing a law, because it's just like today, all the special interests descended on Congress like locusts because they didn't want to make their operations more expensive. They finally passed a law in 1838. It was very draconian, but it apparently wasn't very effective, because 1865 is when the Sultana explodes. Okay, 1866 is the Hartford steam boiler. Now this worked very well because Hartford says, if you do this and this and this and this, we'll insure your boiler, otherwise forget it. And those things that they told you to do were all sound engineering ideas. So a lot of people did them even if they didn't get the insurance. But a lot of people didn't bother to do anything because it wasn't mandatory. And then in 1896, the Railroad Safety Act was quite effective, and one of the things it required is that all operating boilers have an engineer in attendance at all times, which is why we still call the guy who drive trains engineers, because in the beginning they had to be trained as engineers. Now the systems are safer. Continuing, in 1919, we had roughly in the United States 300 to 400 boilers exploding every year. Little ones. In 1919, the National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors came into being. This basically, you could get a sticker on your boiler that said it had been inspected, and it could affect your insurance rates, but a lot of people didn't get the sticker. The following years, they had more government regulation, more insurance regulation, and it has been effective. How many people have heard of a boiler explosion? Not too many. Right today, there's about 73,000 boilers in the state of Michigan alone. They're all over the place, and the safety has improved to the point that they hardly ever explode, even though there's thousands and thousands of them. Okay. So on the boiler safety, obviously you could have a design flaw. Hey, if it's designed badly, it's going to blow up. In manufacture, you could pick the wrong materials. You could have poor workmanship in the joining of the materials. The operator error. If a person doesn't really understand what's happening in the boiler, they can cause a lot of trouble. Adverse environment. Like, for example, the very heavy current flow in the river. This puts stresses on the system that you wouldn't normally expect. Poor maintenance, wait until it breaks, don't inspect it. Malfunction and failure can occur independently of all these others. And, of course, poor management in the sense that management wants to make a few more bucks, and they're not above cutting a few corners. Any questions and comments about boilers or anything up till now? Incidentally, I had personal experience with boilers. When my grandfather built his house, he put a steam boiler in the basement, and he heated the house with steam heat generated by burning wood from the back lot. So a lot of times he explained to me what all the dials and valves did, and I grew up with a boiler in the house. Okay. So, anyways, let's move on. Accident costs. Clear cut. Equipment loss or repair. Okay. Anyone here ever have an automobile accident? Did you have to get an estimate? Yeah, that's what we're talking about, okay? Medical expenses, that's not always so clear. Higher insurance costs. You think, hey, the insurance company covered everything. And then you get your next bill. Even if it's not your fault, your insurance can go up. Pain, loss of life. I mean, if you get injured, it hurts. What's the dollar value for that? It's hard to say. Certainly if someone dies, what can you put on that? And if you decide to sue somebody, the lawyers are going to take their cut. Less visible. Now, if you're in a factory and there's an accident, what you're doing, where the accident occurs, is part of a larger system. So when that accident occurs, the operations that are going on around it can be affected. And in general, if there's an accident, especially if the employees feel that the accident was caused by laxness on the part of management, there's going to be a general morale issue. If the people injured were liked, there's going to be a morale issue whether they think management had something to do with it or not. And that also has an impact. Very hard to determine what that impact is, though. Very hard to quantify it, but it's still there. Simply because you can't measure it, that doesn't mean it isn't there. Okay? Another list. This is from Farm Business Insurance. Now, these people compensate people for loss, and they've done a big computation. Time lost from work by the injured employee, economic loss to the injured employee's family, lost time by fellow workers, maybe for morale or disruption, loss of efficiency due to the breakup of a crew, if there was a member of the crew, loss of time by the supervisors because they have to deal with everything, including the paperwork, cost of training a new crew if someone gets badly injured or killed, damage to tools or equipment, spoilage, fire, water, chemicals. If there's a fire, you got to put it out with water. That damages other stuff. Failure to fill orders. There might be penalties for not meeting a deadline. Overhead costs that you need to deal with while you're not generating any revenue, and about 100 other things. So it's quite a list. Bureau of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that hidden costs are about 4 times the direct costs. So if you want to look at total costs, you estimate the direct cost and multiply by 5. You're in the ballpark. The Pareto principle, most cost is due to a few accidents, more on that in a minute. Hidden costs by other people have estimated as much as 10 times the direct costs. Depends a lot on what you're doing. And of course there's liability, and it's extremely hard to predict what your liability might be for an accident, because it depends on a lot of factors, including the general mood of the population at the time the event occurs. Here's the Pareto principle. There's the guy, Alfredo Pareto. He lived some time ago. He was a sociologist, and he originally used this to describe the distribution of wealth in a nation. But since then, people have found that it applies to a whole bunch of things, and here we're applying it to accidents. Now, what it says here is that a very small number of accidents lead to a very large portion of the cost associated with accidents. So here's what happens. Let's say you're in a company, and this is your costs during May. You had a very small accident cost, and then there was a hidden cost, June, July, August, and then in September you get one of those 2% accidents. And this means that the company can be lulled into believing that their safety program is working well because that very expensive accident has not occurred yet. And then when it occurs, if you have a small company, this could drive you out of business. It could be disastrous. So the Pareto principle is important in that we can't necessarily follow our past track record to predict what's going to happen in the future with respect to costs. So far, accidents are... Any volunteers? How would you characterize accidents?
An event that is unpredicted, unforeseen, or unintended.
So it's unexpected, foreseen, intended. And, okay, that fair? We could say more, but that's the key thing there. Hold on. Let me get all of this up. Costs are what did you say about costs?
We're just talking about like money costs?
Yeah. Well, costs in general. Pain's a cost. Not being able to do what you want to do is a cost. What would you say about costs for that?
I guess the amount it takes to make it right.
Well, that's part of it. I was thinking more of something like this. Costs
Costs are higher.
mainly
Safer.
hidden. Right? Conservative estimate is 80% of costs are hidden. More conservative estimates are 90% of costs are hidden. You were saying something?
The cost can go up if you want to make it safer.
Yeah. So we also have the definite costs of safety. Versus the indefinite and hidden costs of accidents, right? And what can we say about engineers?
Help prevent.
Yeah, we can help a lot, right? There's a lot we can do as engineers to make life better. Yeah, why are we engineers, right? Isn't that the whole idea? Okay. Questions, comments? Okay, now we're going to get into the kind of the abstract stuff. 4 theories of accident causation. The first theory is Heinrich's dominoes, and this is not just the first I'm talking about. This was the first theory in modern times. Then he looked for single causes. Gross 4M looks for multiple factors leading to an accident. And then we go one step further into preventing accidents that we don't expect. And that's where Hadden's energy theory and the 3 E's come in. 3 E's come in. And these are approaches to just kind of generally make the environment or make the situation safer without having a specific kind of accident in mind. So, let's see. Now, the purpose of the theory is twofold. One is we want a framework to learn from history so we can analyze accidents and say, what happened here? What do we need to change? And we also want to use an analytical tool to identify potential hazards and prevent accidents before they ever happen. So there's 2 roles there. Let's start with Heinrich's. His theory was proposed in 1931. He was one of the earliest researchers to look at accidents in industry and tried to present a way to make sense out of it and try to prevent them from happening. He analyzed thousands of accident causes, and he found 88% were caused by unsafe acts. I'll get in that in a minute. 10% by unsafe conditions, and 2% by acts of God. In other words, I don't know what happened. Okay. He assumed that each accident had a single cause, He has a 5-factor accident sequence. Each factor causes the next step. And he would recommend intervention at the earliest possible step. Here's the dominoes. We have an injury or damage, which is caused by an accident, which is caused by an unsafe condition or unsafe act, and that is caused by an undesirable trait. At this time in industry, there was a tendency to blame workers for everything, okay? And that undesirable trait arose from something in the social environment. So the social environment caused the undesirable trait, which caused the unsafe condition, which caused the accident, which caused the injury. And he recommended trying to deal with this as soon as possible in this sequence. So he would say the best thing to do is try to change the social environment. So here's an example. An injury could be a broken arm due to slip on the floor because the floor was wet. The undesirable trait was sloppiness. Somebody put that water there, and maybe other people saw it, and no one said, well, I should wipe that up. And this is because in the social environment, it's accepted to be lackadaisical. Nobody yells at you. It's cool. Hey, I saw a puddle over there and I ignored it. Hey, good job, you know, that kind of thing. Well, maybe not that bad, especially if it turns out that was the guy that slipped. Looking at the Sultana. Okay, let's see. Let me get this up here. Okay, injury. Let's see. We had roughly 1,750 fatalities. Plus injuries. I don't even have figures on how many people were injured. The accident was the boiler explosion, which eventually led to the sinking. What was the unsafe condition? Too many people. Anything else?
They said wrong pressure in the boiler.
They had what?
The high pressure.
Okay, let's say high pressure and a weak boiler. Anything else? Now there was the swift, icy current because of the snow melt coming down, and the fact that we were opposing the current. So the current was going one way, and the vessel was trying to go the other way. Besides, it was going up the map. Everyone knows going up the map is harder than going down the map, right? What was the undesirable trait, do you think?
Greed.
Yeah, I think most people agree on that, except possibly the descendants of the captain and the quartermaster. And what was the social environment? What's that? Now, sloppiness would be an undesirable trait. What's our social environment?
Post-war
Yeah, post-war.
relaxation.
Remember, this is a war fought on U.S. soil. So a lot of people had lost relatives in the war. Life was cheap at the time. Let's see, do I have it here? I think we mentioned earlier, 500,000 people died in the war. So, you know, a couple thousand more is not really going on. And it was also opportunities. The captain saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get a big chunk of money. Okay? So that was the social environment, kind of like in the Westerns, you know, or at least some Westerns. Okay. So that's the Sultana. Now the domino is useful. It focuses primarily on people as causes of accidents. And you could argue that ultimately you end up at a person if you dive down deep enough. It's a limited value to MEs and EEs, but it's really good for IEs because we work a lot with people, and often we have to deal with causes at that level. It's also liked by lawyers because they like it if they can show one person is at fault, especially if it's not their client. Okay. Main difficulty is accidents usually have several causes. It's not that simple. For example, a rear-end collision. You know, who's causing the accident? The guy in front who stopped too quickly? The guy in back who was following too closely? The fact that there was ice on the road? You know, it's usually not that simple. But if you have multiple causes, you can repeat this analysis for different causes. So you can use it over and over again to identify other causes. But main thing is it's a single cause theory, and it focuses mainly on human behavior. People are the root of all injuries. Now let me show you a case where this theory actually works well. This involves seat belts. You have an accident, injury and loss of life in an accident due to an automobile collision. And without seat belts, the unsafe condition is the person might be thrown from the vehicle or collide with other objects inside the vehicle. The undesirable trait at the time was that 89% of people did not use safety belts, and that's because belts just weren't cool. You know, cool people didn't use belts. They also smoked, right? That was the thing. And then along comes these guys. How many people remember these guys? Anyone remember their name? Let's see, one was Larry. I think I wrote the name down here somewhere. These guys were really popular. My son got a doll about this big, okay, where the arms and head comes off. So he could have that. He had a little car that you could put the dummies in the car, you run it up against the wall, and it would all crumble up and everything. They had a TV show with cartoons on it. These guys were really hot, but they didn't come in to make money on television. They were part of a program which had as a theme, you can learn a lot from a dummy. And they basically said, it's dumb to drive around without seatbelts. And it had quite an impact. Usage went from 11% to 47% as a result of this program. And they figured during the time of the program it saved roughly 20,000 lives, not to mention all the injuries also. Now, the crash test dummies changed the social environment. It's no longer cool to go around. But it only went so far. It only got up to about 50%. What brought things up to the current level is belt use laws in states. Click it or a ticket. And that increased compliance to about 90%, which is about where it is today. However, if it wasn't for the dummies that changed the social environment, you never would have gotten those laws passed. Because people would have said, what are you guys, nuts? Why are you passing such a law? And instead they say, well, I don't want to be a dummy, so I won't say anything. So this is a case where the crash test dummies is an example of how the domino theory can actually work. Any questions or comments? All right, here's another theory. Gross is 4M. And now, I've changed this a little bit from in the text. He has man, I got human, because a lot of the people we work with nowadays are female. Okay? Machine, environment, instead of media. Nobody understood what media was. So I changed it to environment. People seem to relate to that better. And then management, 4 M's. I still managed to keep the 4 M's in, even though this M isn't at the beginning. Okay? Still 4 M's. Now the idea is that the environment and the people and the machines, they each have their contribution, but they also interact with one another. And everything takes place in management. Management can affect any of these things and interact with anything. So this is definitely not a one-cause theory. Now human would be the individual workers, the operators, whatever. Environment could be conditions like the weather, humidity, rain, maybe in a factory you're working with hot plastic, maybe you're working with dangerous gases, etc. Basically, it's what you have to deal with around you. Machines could be a big machine, like a big press. It could be a little machine, like an electric drill, or even a pair of pliers. Anything that a person uses as a tool or uses to accomplish something, we would call a machine. And management now, I'm not referring to the guys in suits. I'm talking about the way things are organized or done, the way people interact with each other, the way people react to the environment or are supposed to. That would be management, and that's what he meant also. So on the side, let's see now. Let's write on this one. So for humans, we have the passengers, right? They wanted to get home, and also it was their body weight that contributed to the load on the boilers. But we also had the captain, and we had the quartermaster, and they exhibited certain unfortunate human characteristics which played a role in this. The machine, the ship, this would be the boiler, and specifically, but the ship in general. Environment?
Freezing, weather.
Yeah, okay, so it's freezing cold. Freezing cold.
Crowded.
Current. You mentioned something else?
Crowded, maybe the crowding.
Okay, now the crowding would be under management. And I would put it there because apparently there weren't mechanisms in place to avoid this obvious level of overcrowding. And lots of people saw it, but apparently nobody had the authority to say, wait a minute, let's think about this. Okay? So the crowding would be part of the management. Allowing the crowding would be due to a failure of management. Okay? Anyone want to add anything?
Is the environment just the physical environment, or could it be social too?
Be what?
Could it be social environment as well?
No, this would be the physical environment. For social, we refer to the dominoes. Okay? If you want to get into social, then you could stick it under human, or you could stick it under management, depending on the aspect of it. Okay? But you did remind me of something else. It happened at night. Okay? Yeah, the 4M wouldn't look into the fact that this was the end of the war and soon after Lincoln's assassination. That would be the first method, would look at that. Okay, any question? All right, let's, I got another example here. We're okay. Remember that collision going into the bridge abutment? Okay, so human. Let me get these up. So, what about the human?
Person driving the car. Person driving the car.
Yeah, what about the human that led to this accident?
Not paying attention to the road?
Not paying attention. That's good. How about the environment?
Narrow bridge.
Okay, that would be under the machine.
No markings?
let's see, we could put that under the machine or under management.
Yeah, that'd be more
That's
management.
management. Sign it.
Would it just be a road for environment?
I'm sorry?
Would it just be a road for environment or a bridge?
Yeah, well, you could have a sign up here, far enough ahead that there's a narrow bridge ahead. And then what I've seen is people paint black and reflective stripes on the bridge, red and black or yellow and black. And then what I've seen now is that on the bridges, they'll have something here that's fairly compressive, like maybe barrels full of sand. So if someone actually does run in, they hit that instead of actually hitting the bridge. Okay. But management would be doing that. How about environment? Well, I said it could be at night. So maybe this happened at night, which seems to be more likely than during the daytime. But, you know, even without markings, it might have been in the daytime, and it might have been hard to see it. We would have to have a specific accident in order to fill this in more precisely. But we can see how this
So
works.
then with weather conditions?
We could have weather.
Okay, so that.
It could be icy. No, that could be the reason too. Any other thoughts? You see how that works? And now, when we use these things, well, okay, no markings could go on the machine or it could go here. The main idea of this is to identify causes.
Could be a car.
So if we get a cause, and it's not quite in the right category, that's still good, because they're trying to figure out what caused this accident, okay? So don't get too upset if you get it in the wrong area. I won't get too upset if it's in the wrong area. I'll point it out. But the main thing is to come up with that particular cause. Okay, at least in this course. Questions? Comments? Now we come to the preventive ideas. Here we're not working with an accident. We're just sitting around and thinking and saying, okay, what can we do to make things safer without a particular accident in mind? So the basic idea of Haddon's theory is that damage is caused by energy transfer. And we improve the safety, we can prevent the transfer, we reduce the magnitude of the energy that is transferred, or we can redirect it. That's the three basic strategies. And this is really good for engineers, because we can sit down and look at something we're designing and answer questions on this kind of thing just by looking at what we're doing. I mean, it's really nice, especially for MEs, but also IEs and EEs, because we're talking about energy, and energy can be almost anything. So, for example, prevent the marshalling of energy, ground motors to avoid a static buildup, which will prevent a static discharge, which could injure people or cause a fire. Keep heavy stuff on the floor, right? If you got something heavy, don't put it on the top rack. Put it on the bottom rack. Simple, right? Reduce the amount of energy. School zones. You know, when I first came here 20 years ago, most of the schools didn't have school zones. Cars would be whipping through there 35 miles an hour. Now most of them have school zones, and even people that yell at you if you go too fast. What's the reason? Well, if there is an accident, which is less likely if cars are moving slowly, there will be much less injury, because the kinetic energy is equal to the square of velocity. So that's really good way of doing it. Keep chemicals in smaller bottles. That way, if you drop one and it breaks, you've got less dangerous chemical running around on the floor. Okay? Prevent the release of energy. If you're working on a car, chalk the wheels. That prevents the car from rolling on you, which can be painful. Do you know how safety elevators work? Okay, they're designed so that if the cable that's lifting the car up breaks, this device goes out and immediately stops the car so the car won't fall. Otis came up with that about 100 years ago. Of course, a lot of elevators now are hydraulic, but the ones that run with cables still go that way. Modify the rate or distribution. Bulletproof vest. How does a bulletproof vest work? It spreads the force of the impact, the energy of the impact, over a larger area. person still hurts afterwards, but they're not dead. So that's the idea of a bulletproof vest. It's not really a barrier. All that kinetic energy still hits the person, but it's over a wider area instead of a small one. Parachute. What does a parachute do when it works? It changes you from falling this fast to falling this fast, okay? So at the end, you have a very good chance of walking away. The rate or distribution. Separation in space or time. Divided highway. And I notice it's interesting. When I was young, most highways were 2 lanes with a painted stripe dividing them. And you'd go this way at 55 miles an hour, and the other guy went this way at 55 miles an hour. That would probably make a lot of modern drivers nervous. Now, and then they went to the divided highways. But what I'm noticing now, as we go to El Paso, they're starting to stick lanes in the middle of the divider because they need to expand the highway, and the divider is in the right-of-way, the outside isn't. So instead of trying to get more right-of-way, they're filling in that divider. So eventually, we'll have 4 lanes going this way and 4 lanes going that way with maybe a few concrete barriers preventing one side hitting the other. Progress, right? Okay, so divided highways. The limit number of personnel in dangerous areas. If you don't need to be there and something is dangerous, get out of there. That way, if something bad happens, you get fewer people that are injured. Impose a barrier. We have a compressor, let's see, right about over there, and we don't hear much about it except sometimes in the evening because it's got these really thick soundproof walls. These walls also, in the event the compressor should happen to blow up, which is really, really remote, that would contain the pieces of the compressor in the room. Okay? So soundproof walls, otherwise we'd have to yell in here because of the sound of the compressor. Eyeglasses now, most eyeglasses come standard with ultraviolet filters in them so that the ultraviolet that comes from outside doesn't get into your eyeballs. And that's really important around here because at this altitude, there's a lot of ultraviolet in sunlight. So that would be a barrier. Let's see. Modified surfaces inside cars. Now everything is contoured and padded. Back in the 50s, they weren't like that. Rounded corners on furniture, so if you run into a table at night when you're trying to get a glass of water, it doesn't destroy you. Strengthen the individual. Vaccinations. By giving people vaccinations, we reduce the risk of them getting a contagious disease. Buildings, hurricane resistant. It's funny, I saw a study that went down into Florida. They introduced a new code for buildings, and they had aerial photographs of areas. The buildings built to the new code were still there. The buildings built to the old code were gone and wiped out by the hurricane. So you really can build a building that will stand up to most hurricanes. Act quickly to correct, medical first aid, search and rescue. You want to get out there and resolve the issue, find people if they're there. Act quickly to restore, for example, repairing utilities after a storm, get those electric lines working again so people can heat their houses, and rehabilitation for people that are injured so they can re-enter a productive society. Now, it's the same thing as with the 4M. The idea of this list is to give you ideas. If you come up with an idea and it's not quite in the right category, that's okay. The idea is to come up with the idea. So you run down this list and you look at your design and say, oh, I could do this, or I could do that. And the idea here is we're not preventing any particular accident. We're just trying to set up an environment in which an accident is less likely to occur. That's Haddon's 10 strategies to improve safety. Okay. Something else that's happened since the 50s. Cars now are designed like we used to build race cars back in the 50s. Okay. And that is the passenger compartment is what we call a safety cage, and it's designed to be very strong and very unlikely to deform. The rest of the car is what we call a crumple zone. And the idea is that if you have an accident, that crumple zone will absorb part of the energy and not transfer that energy to the people in the safety cage. Got it? Okay, so just quickly, can you come up with a couple of strategies that Haddon would suggest that is evident in this design?
Modify distribution.
Okay, distribution. Good. The crumple zones modify the distribution of the energy.
Maybe strengthening the safety cage? Strengthening the safety cage?
Well, the cage is strengthened, but we talk about strengthening of the individual. So strengthening the safety cage would be a kind of barrier, right? Because the idea of the safety cage is if you have a pole or something, it goes through the crumple zone but doesn't deform the rest of the car much, although it can do that.
Modify surfaces with airbag.
Okay. Modify surfaces, especially inside the safety cage. Now, airbags is another strategy. We'll talk about them later, but that's not part of this particular design aspect. But certainly, airbags are helpful too. Okay? Well, we're running late here, so I'm going to move on. You may come up with some others later. Remember the auto collision? Okay. So let's look at that. Any ideas here?
Modify surfaces.
Okay. Which ones?
Well, you could do the bridge itself, like widen it, or put barriers there.
Okay, well, modify the surfaces would be like putting, making this rounded or something. Making the bridge wider would be a form of separation. Okay?
Reduce the amount of energy.
Right, and putting a crumple zone here, that would be the distribution of energy. Okay?
Could strengthen the individual by putting signs up. So it's like,
Let's see, I'm not sure where signs would fit in this. It's not really strengthening the individual. Driver safety training would be something like that. Let's see. I guess signs would be a kind of separation.
yeah.
We could also have a slow speed limit here, which would reduce the amount of energy in a collision if the guy does hit the bridge. Okay. And this isn't meant to be exhaustive. Oh, the Sultana. We've been meeting that one to death, haven't we? Any ideas there from Haddon?
Separation.
Okay, separation. How would you separate?
Don't take.
Yeah. Fewer passengers, right? Separate them from the vessel. Okay. Anything else?
You could say prevent the release of energy, maybe that barrier around.
Okay. Okay, now the barrier would be a barrier.
Yeah.
Okay. How could we prevent the release of energy? What do you think they didn't have?
Maybe a pressure relief valve.
Yeah. Safety valve. You could see the one boiler exploding because it was damaged, but the other two exploding means that they were running these things at too high a pressure. Okay? So we can see that. We could certainly do more. But I want to get the last one, which was 3 E's: engineering, education, and enforcement. And now this looks at another way of solving it. So we go to the Sultana. Okay, engineering could be safer boilers. Education, operators. Let them know fully the consequences of putting 3,500 people on the ship. And enforcement, you know, they were bending the rules. So inspection.
And consequences.
And let's say some kind of clearance to sail.
Penalty.
Well, yeah, and penalties. Okay, so that's Sultana. That collision. Okay, for engineering, those crumple zones, right? Wider bridge. Education, now the sign, I think, would be a form of education. That's about all we can expect at this point. In enforcement, if we have the speed limit, and then an officer around there can enforce that limit. I don't know if the officer can enforce much about the bridge directly, but a lower speed limit, the guy would have something. Okay. Any questions? All right, real quickly, here's what we did. Accidents, unexpected, unwanted, unplanned, unintended, unliked, okay. The Sultana, how many people remember the Sultana? There we go, better than the first time. Engineers are involved, as we see, in many ways, and primarily in this course we're going to be focusing on what engineers can do. We notice there's direct costs, indirect costs, and hidden costs, and just because we don't see them, that doesn't mean they're not there. We talked about some theories of causation. Let's see, it was Heinrichs and Gross. And then we talked about prevention. That was Haddon and the 3 E's. There are other theories, but that's what we talked about here. And then we talked about, there you go, Vince and Larry, the crash test dummies. Here's the links. I didn't get a chance to check these, so if something doesn't work, let me know. And those links are, oops, I clicked on a link. And those are for Lecture 2. Okay. And now for next time, it really will be Lecture 3, okay? And we're going to talk about changing views of regulation and liability. And you can read about this in chapters 4, 5, and 7. It's a lot of chapters, but they're little chapters. All set? Okay, then let's go.